Okay, let's start part 3 of lecture 1. I want to take a moment here, take a pause before we go into this third part, just to kind of pull us back together a little bit. Take a breath, for me at least. So we're moving into talking about what I'm calling the cultural approach to communication, but it's a little confusing, I think. You're going to get a lot more about organizational theory clearly from your other class, and you're going to see the parallels, as I've said before, and some of the repetition of this discussion of classical and human resources. And when you get to cultural, I think what's interesting is that this is still, it's a theory, right? It's a theory about how understanding the culture of an organization and valuing the culture of an organization also changes the structure of an organization. So just keep that in mind, that this is a little fuzzier, if you will. And just so you know, as we go through this, I'm going to talk about Google at the end of this as the example. And I think it's a perfect example of where an organizational structure is really embodied with its organizational culture, and how that impacts also the patterns of communication that are in that organization. So let's take a look at the cultural approach. Okay, so each organization, any organization, has unique characteristics, right? We can look at an organization and see its traditions, its language that is used. When I say language, I also mean the form of language that is used, the language between people that is used, symbols, everything from the corporate logo to literally symbols, practices, times you arrive at work, times you leave work, expectations for lunchtime, breaks, leaves, all that stuff, pastimes, and social conveniences. Everything that a organization has put in place tells us something about its culture, right? And the other thing we know is that these characteristics, this culture, distinguishes one organization from another, that each culture is unique. And I think that's especially true as we're moving into these new types and styles of company. Can a particular culture be replicated? Is the culture at Google replicated in the culture at Apple Computer, for example? And then the histories, the stories, the customs, the social norms that these characteristics I just mentioned create the culture, right? Right? That the culture is the history and the customs and the stories. And the reason I'm putting this in is because of the Google case study I want to show you, where a culture was established and then the culture became embedded in terms of its history and its customs, and then it of course faced growing pains. So if you have an organizational culture, that implies certain things. It implies that there are a set of shared values and beliefs, there are common practices, there are customarily observed rules, and mutually understood meanings. Now, you could say in the classical structure we talked about at the very beginning, right, some of that would exist, customarily observed rules and common practices, right? That's exactly the uniform approach. But not necessarily shared values and beliefs. There may be posted values and beliefs. And are there mutually understood meanings? So I think you could say all four of these things exist in a classical and in a human resource model. But I think it's interesting, and maybe in your organizational theory class you'll talk about it. So in a modern organization, right, if we move from a human resource model and we're looking at culture's impact on organization, here's what I think you see. This particular Anupam Kumar has suggested that if you look at an organization in a much more flowing way, and you have the formal organizational structure, which is only one piece, right, as opposed in our classical approach, that is the formal organizational structure is what exists. But he is saying that the formal organizational structure is one piece, the individual in the organization, who they are, what they value, is another piece. The informal organization, which is something we're going to talk about in my third lecture in terms of the communication structure in an organization, the physical setting, and then the roles and status patterns in an organization, how that's been set up. All of those things go in to form the identity, right? And all of those things hopefully focus in on an organizational objective, right? Whatever you're trying to produce or achieve in the organization. Schein, who is sort of the father of this cultural approach, and you will hear more about the theories, he divided an organization's culture into 3 levels. And I just want to mention this because I'm going to talk about artifacts. Artifacts are the overt elements of an organization. Artifacts are going to tell us a lot about an organization. And I'm going to go so far as to call these communication artifacts because they communicate about the patterns that are going on in the organization. The espoused values, that's the visual declared values, right? And the basic assumptions, right, that are underneath. And this is where I think things go wrong. Basic assumptions, assuming making an ass out of you and me. And you're going to see where Google, right, artifacts, right, show very clearly a style and a culture of an organization. The espoused values you're going to hear, right? But then when you got to the assumptions underneath, that's when things started going wrong. So if we had to kind of capture this approach, this cultural approach, just like we said, the productive employee, right? A managed employee is a productive employee. A happy employee is a productive employee. I think in the cultural approach, keeping it loose, the employee is the organization in the sense that the employee is what creates the culture, right, and buys into the culture. And the interaction, if you will, between employees creates the culture, which is then the organization. So I mentioned the artifacts earlier, right? And we learn from looking at organization artifacts. And I think we learn not only what the organization is, but how it values its employees and how it values its employees through communication. So I just want to take a look at a couple of these, all right? If you were going to do a survey of the artifacts of an organization, right, you would look at the architecture. What does it tell you about the company, right? How structured is the architecture? Is the furniture the same for the staff that are in a department as in an administration? Is there an open seating? What kind of spaces are available for social interaction, right? The technology, I know this sounds funny, but what and how is the technology used for? And how is it accessed by the various levels of employees? The dress, we talked about dress as a non-verbal form of style of communication, right? Written documents, again, a style of communication. The artwork itself, right? What kind of artwork, right? Is it modern? Is it classical? Or do employees decorate their own spaces, right? What do those spaces look like? What kind of visual symbols are informally and formally being put out for the workplace? Forms of address, again, I mentioned this as a style of communication. That's why I say these artifacts are so many of these are communication artifacts. The and the form of address not only verbally but in emails, how people address each other in emails, and now how people address each other through Zoom is also very interesting to me. And communication during meetings. And communication during meetings, we'll talk next lecture about group communication, but how people refer to the person who is leading the meeting, where people sit during a meeting, right, are all artifacts about how the organization values its employees. Decision-making style, we'll talk about that in the third lecture as well, but exactly what happens when decisions need to be made and how employees are involved in that. And finally, communication patterns, which of course, communication patterns to me, right, is this piece of what's the network of communication and how does it tell us a lot about the employees in the organization. And if you're wondering, what I mean by that is who talks to whom, right? Allows us to identify various roles. That's what I'm going to talk about in my third lecture. All right, so if we look at the communication, our 4 communication factors in terms of this cultural approach, remembering that much of communication is in those artifacts, right? We can look at and realize that there's no boundaries to the content of the communication in this cultural approach, because we are looking at everything, right? And what every way people talk, what they talk about, right? And it's not just what they talk about, obviously, but the communication, as I mentioned earlier, that you see visually, right? The flow is totally multi-directional, right? Because now we're including all and any kinds of communication. The channel, right? Any or all channels for communication. And the style, right? Of the nonverbal and the verbal and the style of address, all of that, right, is constantly challenging and changing. There's not one accepted route, probably. So this is chaos, right? And just to give you, again, one more little highlight about where I'm going with this, the systems approach really is a quantitative way to capture all of this information and try to look at communication in an organization in the broadest way possible, not just the formal communication between management and employee, but all the communication that goes on in any given work environment can be captured and studied and help us understand how employees are valued and what roles employees are playing. And that's where my third lecture is going to go. Okay, so this is Google. And just take a minute and look at this picture. For everything we were just talking about, right? What's on the walls, the furniture, the colors, the style of clothing, right? All of it tells us something about the environment for this organization, right? Some of it I find very childlike, and I think that's an interesting element to the response to sort of the cultural theories and organizations like Google and the requirements that millennials have for their work environments and their workspaces. But you also get such a flow of innovation going on. You can see a meeting going on at the same time people are playing golf. I think we're supposed to assume that while they're playing golf, they're interacting in business context, but who knows? I love the teddy bear up there. Again, you see these little cubicles that people have for working. And of course, technology is everywhere. Oh, I guess I lost the last one. Okay. So let's talk about Google. I want to show you a couple of examples, a couple of videos, and show you what I think happens, what's been happening at Google, and the result of as a culture grows and ages, right, and takes itself seriously, what can happen. So again, I'm going to escape out of this. We're going to come over here. If I can get over here. Here we go. And let me play this first one for you.
Google is a place that I just fell in love with the culture. I fell in love with the interview. There was just a vibe.
Sorry,
I just
guys.
fell in love with the culture. I fell in love with the interview. There was just a vibe that I wanted to be a part of.
It's just some place where I can never imagine myself getting bored, because we're thinking about billions of users, and so that's a lot of impact that you can have, and it's just really gratifying.
Google is so much at the forefront of technology, and the way that our culture is built, we are always looking for the 10x. We are always looking for the leapfrog innovation.
So you have to be willing to let all your preconceived notions be broken at any moment.
You're going to have to make your own rules sometimes, and this is actually part of the fun.
I get to try new technologies. I get to implement them in different ways that maybe no other company has done them before. And so you can really go beyond your skill set that you think you have at the moment and push the boundaries.
The part that makes it really fun is
there are so many teams across Google that have amazing expertise. And I get to work with these people, not only build something with them, but I learn so much.
Pick any topic, and I can promise you there's someone here who is both better at it than you or more knowledgeable, and also, more importantly, willing to help you learn.
Everybody here is so nice. They're so encouraging. So that's very reassuring to be in a company where people value you.
I am fortunate enough to work with people from a lot of different experience, a lot of different backgrounds, and we use that in our advantage.
It's really the best idea wins. There's a lot of debate, but it's really to bring those different viewpoints together, and that's what we want our products to represent.
We believe the benefits of technology should apply to all. And that's a mission that really is very, very inspiring.
So when I show up at work, I'm able to do all the things that I love, solving hard problems and working for the people that I manage. That makes it worthwhile for me to show up every day.
Sounds great, huh? You can sense their excitement. It's like, wow, a whole different kind of work environment. And I think it really is and really was. And it took its culture very seriously. Here, I just want to show you, I'm going to be sending you the links to these articles, but I just wanted to show you this article that Google actually has a position that is called Cultural Czar. And this guy is the Cultural Czar. This guy, Stacy Sullivan's guy. See, I assumed it was a guy. I meant a woman. That's terrible of me. I apologize. So she's the cultural czar, right? And I want you to just see what she says here. We want all of our employees to play a part. I'm going to highlight it. We want all of our employees to play a part in being involved in keeping our culture the way it is today, but also growing and developing it. So some of it is coming up with different programs and processes and just being there to talk with people when they have issues, setting up websites where people can report bugs and their culture and ideas on how to improve it, and those types of things. Okay, so here she's talking about how she believes that they can provide, employees can provide input, right? And I want to just go down a little further. What are some of the challenges? They say, I think one of the hardest things to do is to ensure that we are hiring people who possess the kind of traits that we're looking for in a Google employee. Googly is defined as someone who is fairly flexible, adaptable, and not focusing on titles and hierarchy and just gets stuff done. Now, what's fascinating to me about that is, in itself, it is as rigid as the classical hiring I talked about in the first part of the lecture, where they were trying to hire employee selection to fit, right, into the efficiency mode. Now we're hiring employees that can fit into this flexible mode. So I'm going to let you read more of that article, and I want to talk more about this at class on Wednesday. What I want to move over here to now is what's going on in Google today.
As the company's handling of sexual misconduct claims. New York Times investigation last week showed...
Sorry, it takes a minute for it to do this. Okay.
The company's handling of sexual misconduct claims. New York Times investigation last week showed how Google paid millions of dollars in exit packages to Andy Rubin and other male executives accused of misconduct. The Times says Rubin, who created the Android mobile software, was paid $90 million. Rubin's publicist said in a statement, quote, Mr. Rubin left Google on his own accord in 2014. He did not engage, nor has ever been told of any misconduct at Google or anywhere else. New York Times reporter Kate Benner was a co-author of the story and joins us at the table now. Kate, great to have you. We've been talking about this story all week. I'm curious because Google's official code of conduct on their website ends with, don't be evil, and if you see something that you think isn't right, speak up. How does that play into this decision for the walkout today?
Sure, I think that a lot of people come to Google because they are really idealistic and they do believe in this idea of a company standing for something larger than just making money. And so to see this sort of behavior and to see it condoned at the very highest levels of the company, I think has been extraordinarily upsetting for employees. And if you look at the $90 million payout to a single employee who was credibly found to have sexually assaulted somebody, I think that's galling for people.
This walkout is already underway all over the world, in Germany and in Asia, and there are specific demands, right, that they want.
Correct.
What are they?
That's correct. So the employees are saying it's enough is enough. They want more transparency. They want the end to forced arbitration, especially in cases of sexual harassment. So right now, the company does force employees to be in arbitration, which is a very private process. They want an annual accountability report, transparency around harassment, because they're looking at the fact that many executives have been fired for sexual harassment and misconduct, and they had no idea. So they would like that as well. They also want a global, uniform way to safely report sexual harassment, because that currently doesn't exist.
And the company doesn't have that now?
No.
Well, Google executives certainly have some explaining to do. This is embarrassing, this is painful, and clearly mistakes were made. What can you tell us about how Google executives are handling this? It doesn't seem like they're running for the hills on this.
No, so it's really interesting. The CEO Sundar, he has been extraordinary. Sundar Pichai, he responded very strongly after the story came out. Google did not push back on us in many ways on the story. We always do. We run all reports by the companies and give them fair warning. And in fact, his statement afterwards said we need to make a clean break with the past. And
Didn't he say he supported people speaking out?
And he supported the walkout today. What's important about that is by supporting the walkout, by coming out and making those statements, he's also drawn a line in the sand that the employees can look at and hold them accountable to, rather than not speaking at all.
Does Google have a women problem? I mean, 30% of their workforce is comprised of women. Their CFO, Ruth Porat, is obviously a woman as well. Do they have internal issues regarding diversity?
Well, I think that a lot of the employees would say that they do. And even though they do have women in high-level executive positions, I don't think that having a woman in a high-level executive position means that you don't have a problem with gender discrimination.
Can we go back to the Andy Rubin issue, because it's obviously the one everybody pays so much attention to? How can his publicist say that he had never been told of any misconduct? Is there some words that are being monkeyed with here, or what?
You know, I'm not an attorney, and I'm not Andy Rubin's attorney. I can just say that we give everybody a chance for fair comment, and they're allowed to say what they like. We stand by our reporting. My colleague Dai Wakabayashi, who is an extraordinary reporter, was able to find documentation and other bits of reporting that we felt is very strong.
Do employees have confidence in the leadership, do you think?
Well, I think that's to be seen, because there's the walkout today, and then there's the response to the walkout. Will the leadership comply with any of these demands? You know, another demand is that they want pay equity. Google, for a long time, has refused to release any numbers about how men are paid versus women. They've come up with many excuses why they won't do this. So, these are really basic moves, and I think that once the employees have made the demands, if the company doesn't respond, I think some of the goodwill that we see today will be lost.
Is there something specific about Google and the way it's set up its board that makes it difficult to make changes?
Absolutely, and this is very typical of Silicon Valley companies, where they give the founders complete control. We've seen it at Uber, we've seen it at WeWork, which is a really hot...
Sergey Brin and Larry Page.
So Sergey Brin and Larry Page have complete control. So the board can't really remove them, and they can't do much to discipline them. So the employee pressure becomes really important.
Well, it's an important conversation to have, and as you said, the CEO is really saying that he hears all of this, and he's supporting this walkout today. It's the first step. Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's just fascinating that you have a company that is, clearly different. I'm sorry.
Motley Fool. Behind me is Landmark
Sorry.
Mall, or what used to be, what once was a bustling.
Sorry about that, guys. This is what I say. Can't always control everything. All right. But what I started to say was that here you have a company that is apparently structurally and in its communication approaches very, very different, and yet still has some of the same problems, right? And I think there's a couple of lessons to be learned from that. I'm going to start my slideshow again just for a second here, and let's go to the next slide. So we take our little breath here. I think that going in as organizational development practitioners and the style of the company and the style of the communication, you are still going to be looking at some of the same kinds of change requirements or problems, right? And it's fascinating to me because what you have at your disposal is, if you can look at the communication patterns in a company and you can look at the artifacts, it may help you find different ways to approach these companies, right? But also recognize that they aren't always that different. If you remember, I said that the classical communication structure, the classical structure is sometimes embedded in what appears to be a very new and novel company. So that said, let's go to this little quick summary I have. First of all, the communication, content, flow, and channel and style, right, will help you identify an organization's structure, right? If you do kind of an inventory of what's the content of their communication, what's the flow, and I'm talking about the primary content, the primary flow of the formal communication. What's the primary channels, what's the styles, right? It could help you identify not only the structures, but weaknesses in the structure. And the artifacts, right, that you look at, and especially the communication artifacts, right, tell you something about how the employees are valued. In going into a situation where you want to affect change, being able to understand that not all employees are equal, this is one way, right, you can see what is going on with that. So that said, what I want to do is I'm going to be emailing you a worksheet, and I want you to take the worksheet, think about an organization that you are currently in or have been in. You're probably not far enough along in your new practicum setting, so you don't necessarily have to use that for this worksheet. You might use the worksheet later to help you. And I want you to go through the two pieces the artifacts and the communication style, flow, content, and channel, and see if you can come up with a summary observation from your data that might help you. Then I want you to think about these two questions. This is what I'm going to start with when we meet on Wednesday. Do you think identifying the communication structure in an organization will help you as an OD consultant? Maybe not. Maybe all this that I've given you isn't useful, and I'd like to talk about that. What can you do with, or how can you use your insights into the communication structure to help with organizational change? So how might you use this? Okay, so I'm going to end that there. I appreciate your patience with these first set of lectures. I'll get your feedback on Wednesday, and we'll keep working to improve them. And I'll see you Wednesday, September 2nd at 6:30.